Hello and welcome to today's webinar, All Together Now, Exploiting the Supply Chain, the fourth episode in our CMMC Why Do We Do It webinar series. Today's presentation is brought to you jointly by Neosystems and Exiger. I'm Don Carnevale, Marketing Director at Neosystems, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can enter them into the Q&A area within Zoom. We should have time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. Now I'd like to introduce the host for today's discussion, Stuart Itkin from Neosystems. Stuart?
Hey, Don, thank you. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today for the fourth in our webinar series entitled CMMC, Why Do We Do It? As Don mentioned, today's presentation is sponsored by Neosystems and by Exiger. At Neosystems, we're experts who live and breathe compliance, reporting, and regulatory requirements so you don't have to. We provide a range of back office IT and information security managed services and offer organizations an accelerated, affordable, low-risk path to CMMC compliance readiness. Exiger is revolutionizing the way organizations, corporations, government agencies, and banks navigate risk and compliance in their third parties, supply chains, and customers through its software and tech-enabled solutions. Exiger's mission is to make the world a safer and more transparent place to succeed. Well, today's webinar, as we mentioned, is the fourth in a series that describes the relationship between cyber threats we all face every day, vulnerabilities that commonly exist in organizations and their information systems, and the safeguards that are required in NIST 800-171 for CMMC. This webinar series will help people understand why we're doing CMMC. There's a reason why CMMC requirements exist, and it starts with understanding the things that threaten the security of government, customer, and proprietary information that exist in our organizations and in our information systems. It's no longer about the risk of being the target of a cyber attack. Your business is targeted every day. It's about the risk of being the victim of a successful cyber attack. With cyber attacks growing in frequency and sophistication, they threaten not only the security of your companies and your customers' information, but they also threaten the ability of your business to stay in business. Implementing security measures and protocols that guard against these threats and that eliminate potential vulnerabilities is critical. In this 8-part webinar series, we'll delve into specific cyber threats and attacks that exist today and explain how they function and, more important, how they can be defeated. Each episode will speak to a different set of cyber threats and vulnerabilities, and you can see the topics it will address over the 8 segments on the screen. We said our fourth episode is entitled All Together Now, Exploiting the Supply Chain, and we'll explain how those you depend on to provide components, subassemblies, parts, software, and other goods and services can potentially disrupt your business as well as your ability to deliver goods or services to your customers, and how this ultimately affects the flow of goods and services to the Department of Defense. No matter what your business is, you are a link in one or more supply chains, and at the same time, you depend on people who supply to you, and in turn, there are those you supply to who depend on you. So therefore, or before we get started, let me have our speakers introduce themselves. My name is Stuart Itkin. I'm a Senior Vice President at Neosystems. Much of my career is centered on supply chain and vendor risk management and regulatory compliance. I was formerly Vice President of Product Management at Exiger and served as a member of the CMMC Standards Working Group and participated in the establishment of the CMMC accreditation body, now the Cyber AB. I've also served as the Vice President of CMMC and FedRAMP Assurance at Coal-Fire Federal. Ed?
Hi, thank you, Stuart. Welcome, everybody, to this next in this series. I'm Ed Bassett. I'm a cybersecurity evangelist with Neosystems. My perspective is that of a cybersecurity practitioner who's managing security systems, security programs at scale in a managed services model. So that's how I look at this in the sense of how to take some of the requirements that we're seeing coming out of the DoD and turn those into reality for our customers.
And Katie?
Hi, I'm Katie Arrington, the former CISO of Acquisition and Sustainment at the DoD. the mommy of the CMMC, but I will say I think I've given that nod. So the stepmother, because Stacey Bosgenic's now the mommy of the CMMC, and I'm currently the Vice President of Government Solutions or Government Affairs here at Exiger, and my partner and peer and one of my dear friends, JC Hertz, is joining us as well. JC.
Hi, I'm JC Hertz. I am the SVP of Cyber Supply Chain at Exiger, which is software and logic-bearing devices and anything that can bring risk in through code. And I was the co-founder of Ion Channel, a startup that Exiger acquired to have this capability in 2023.
Great. Well, thank you all. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, and we're going to start by talking about why it's important to understand and manage supply chain risk and what exactly we mean by supply chain. We'll explain how an attack on someone in your supply chain or simply a vulnerability of someone in your supply chain can affect your business. We're going to discuss the consequences of such an attack and provide two examples, the first involving software supply chain risk, the second showing the impact of a cyber attack on a small supplier. And finally, we'll discuss how the NIST 800-171 control framework provides guidance and perhaps a good starting point for understanding and managing supply chain risk. So let's start at the beginning. And Ed, as I said earlier, every business is part of other organizations' supply chain, and every business has suppliers it depends on. So why is understanding and managing supply chain risk so important?
Well, it's important because there's a lot of risk in the supply chain. I think people have a tendency to focus on their own risks. They're direct and they can see them, they can manage them quite easily. But they could actually be experiencing more risk from the supply chain than from themselves. The threat actors have figured this out. The statistics on the screen, illustrate that the attacks on the supply chain are on the increase. We're up 78% from last year, according to Symantec. So that affects essentially all of us. The blue voyant statistic on the screen says 97%. That means companies, may be unknowingly accepting a lot more risk than they intend from those downstream suppliers. And the increase in supply chain exploitation is happening because, frankly, these indirect attacks are effective. An attack on the supplier can have a widespread impact, potentially compromising many companies, many weapon systems, even many industries. So very widespread, depending on the role of the supplier. The attackers are targeting suppliers that give them this sort of leverage. The suppliers also sometimes less well defended, perhaps because they're not seen as guarding the crown jewels. They don't think of themselves that way. Even their customers may not think of themselves that way. But because they provide some indirect access to some of those crown jewels, they're getting targeted. It's incumbent upon DoD contractors to understand and manage this risk. Often the suppliers themselves can't fully evaluate the risk they pose. They lack context. Really need to look at it from the top down, taking the risk of each supplier in context and managing that as a whole to eliminate weak links and single points of failure.
Yeah. And I think to your point, it's often the smaller suppliers that that perhaps represent more risk simply because lack of understanding and lack of ability to really address some of those risks. So let's step back and talk about what we mean by supply chain. NIST defines supply chain as a linked set of resources and processes between multiple tiers of organizations, which begins with sourcing of products and services that extends through their life cycle. For a platform like the F-35, this includes activities such as design, development, manufacturing, processing, handling, delivery, and ultimately sustainability of the platform. And the supply chain is the entire network of entities that are directly or indirectly interlinked and interdependent in serving the same customer. The important point is that we can see here is that a supply chain is multi-tiered. A prime contractor has subcontractors. Those subcontractors in turn have subcontractors and suppliers. And those subcontractors and suppliers have their own subcontractors and suppliers and so forth. And sometimes this can go 12, 13, 14 levels deep in terms of the number of tiers. And a failure or an incident at any point in the supply chain can affect the prime contractor's ability to deliver to the DoD. If we think of the F-35 strike fighter, Lockheed Martin is the prime. There are thousands of companies in the F-35's multi-tiered supply chain, and the inability of any one of them to perform or deliver on time poses a risk to Lockheed's ability to supply to the Department of Defense. And if you look at the overall F-35 program, Lockheed is just one of the DoD suppliers. The DoD also depends on MRO or maintenance and repair organizations, parts suppliers, and others. And one thing to note in producing the F-35, Lockheed and everyone in its supply chain utilizes technology to run their businesses and perform business activities. They have ERP systems, they may have computer-aided design or product lifecycle management. But the point is that the technology that runs their businesses is comprised of hardware and software. Those systems are complex. They're multi-layered with their own supply chains. And those supply chains, the software supply chain and the electronic supply chain, are equally important to understand, and we will delve into that. They are part of the supply chain equation. So, Katie, when we talk about supply chain risk, we're looking at the vulnerabilities that exist with individual suppliers or their risk. And how does this translate into risk to their customer? How does the risk associated with a supplier affect the contractor that they are supporting?
Oh, it's everything, right? So what we're doing right now at Exiger, we go through and we use a lot of primes, use Exiger capability, where we can really quickly come up with a score, right? And we tell the prime what they look like cyber-wise, right? And the entirety of the supply chain. Where businesses don't understand, and this is, the CMMC, and I said this in the very beginning when we started this, right? CMMC isn't about checking the boxes per se. It's more about understanding the culture of what it means to be risk adverse. And in a supply chain today, you have so many multiple parts. And I at the beginning, you were talking about the primes to the subs, to the subs, to the subs. And we've all stood by, or in the past, 50 years, and we talk about contract privity. And the fact that the prime, right, when you can use Lockheed Martin as a prime example, right? The first iteration of, what is it, the J-22 or the J-20? The J-20 that China launched, which was basically the duplicate of the F-35, had the same canopy flaw as the original design of the F-35. So Lockheed Martin, we don't, they passed the Joint Surveillance Program. They're not the concern. The concern is, as you stated, Stuart, 7 tiers below, and saying that I have contract privity and I can't look below the supply chain is wrong. The primes are looking all the way down their supply chains. They are looking to the 100th level, because they understand now that they are the sole responsibility for anything that happens within that program or that supply chain. So it's critical that people understand that the primes are looking and they're deciding on these scores that are coming from companies like Exiger and others, whether they want to do business or not. And if your cyber score isn't good, that means that the culture behind your company is not where it needs to be to take on the risk of doing the work for the DoD or other federal agencies. So it's huge right now, and companies need to understand. I joked around when we started this, when Al Gore started created the internet. Nobody understood how connected we were. COVID, we were able to see, okay, we're connected. When we watched Volt Typhoon, when we've watched Solar Winds, we've watched how our connectivity is so interlinked. And we have to understand that the risk, and the logo on the start of this, the weakest link, that supplier at the 15th tier has a problem. That is a problem for the entirety of the supply chain. The adversaries know who is in the supply chain, and they're targeting the weakest link. So it's critically important that companies take it seriously. I mean, I guess supply chains, cyber, all interlinked. One is not more important than the rest.
And Katie, it's not just cyber risk that exists within the supply chain, is it? I mean, there's financial risk, there's environmental risk, geopolitical. How do these things figure in as well?
They're absolutely. So our model at Exiger, we replicated what the DoD risk taxonomy is, and that is comprised of 12 risk factors, everything from foci, foreign ownership and controlling interest, financial health, cyber, ESG, regulatory issues. So primes are looking at all of those risk factors. They have to, because they're responsible for them. So this isn't just cyber. It's, has your company had a violation with OSHA? That will directly affect. Have you not, you don't have I would say, a ransomware attack, it gets known and it's put into your cyber score. I mean, BitSite and Security Scorecard are out there every day, giving what is happening to the internet, to your IP address every day. That's open source information. So the risk factors are those 12 that the DoD has. We have codified them into 7 different buckets of risk, and cyber includes a great deal. And we have the software. JC is an expert on the software supply chain and how critical that is. That's another vulnerability that people just don't understand. If you're not uploading a patch appropriately and correctly at the time of relevance, you're going to completely mess up a system. So it's not just cyber at all.
Exactly. And maybe I think you mentioned about software. JC, it's not just engineering and manufacturing companies that directly contribute to weapon systems and to platforms for the DoD. Risk comes from the supporting players. For example, as we discussed, the software a company uses to operate its business. There's supply chain risk as well. So can you help explain what exactly do we mean when we talk about the software supply chain and software supply chain risk?
Yeah, so the software supply chain is inherently dual use. So, and this is what we struggle with, when he was, Richard Danzig wrote a paper called, Surviving on a Diet of Poison Fruit, right? And that's kind of where we are, because a lot of software is no longer built from scratch. There are some very special systems where it's built from scratch, from source. First, the coders are doing all the code in the system. That is like a tiny percentage of the software that we have. The rest is a combination of the code that companies are writing, their software developers are writing, and then just a ton of open source components and licensed proprietary components. And there's a lot of vendors out there who want to pretend that all the risk comes from open source software, and there's a lot of risk in open source software.
Yeah.
But having torn apart a lot of systems at Exiger in critical infrastructure, that software also includes things that are licensed in, and those things are controlled by companies, and there's a whole bunch of mergers and acquisitions that happen. And so sometimes, Katie was talking about the 15th tier down. Sometimes the OEMs don't even know what's in their stuff, because they bought something from someone who acquired something that acquired something and acquired something, and whatever it was originally named and the vulnerabilities against that has been occluded, has been relabeled. And so one of the first things that I advocated for Exiger to do when I bought my company was to buy another company called Adolis that can rip up those binaries and tell you what that stuff really is. And even the ability to reattribute things that have been white labeled to you, right, is a game changer, because now you really know what it is, and you can manage what you can measure. And so there's an increase in transparency on the open source. We're telling our customers, how many Huawei engineers are working on their open source dependencies, or if you want to use that front end work, that belongs to a web design agency in Guangzhou. So that's, if you want to accept that risk of using this pretty software, you're going to have to manage it. So there's a huge transparency, but then on the other side, in the acquisitions, transparency only helps when the customer is willing to give preferential selection to the providers, the suppliers that maintain a higher security posture. So this is the bet we're all making right now. DoD, CMMC, suppliers, security vendors, everyone else. We are betting that the customer, if they know everything, if they have transparency, is going to decide to pay more or to preferentially select vendors that maintain better supply chain risk management, better cyber, better everything. It's an open question. And this is the economic experiment that we're all in. But what we are doing with some of the companies that we support through like a assured product assurance playbook is giving them the quals to say, look at all the things we've done, to go to a big customer like the Defense Department and say, we want to be a trustworthy supplier. Is there a speedier lane that we can get into, or can we get any credit for this? And that's an important question to answer in the affirmative, because it's not just all about beating the supplier about the head with a stick, because everybody's got issues.
Yeah.
It's about how do we choose better and pay for it.
And I think it's a matter as well of kind of getting people to care or understand it. I mean, it's hard just when it comes to general cybersecurity of getting people to care about things, they can't see, feel, touch, or hold in their hands. And when we start to look at then, risk within the software supply chain, that's almost another degree of separation or abstraction from something you can physically understand. You see challenges in getting people to truly appreciate, the need to look at software bills of material to understand kind of what, where their software comes from.
So we have some exquisite technical capabilities to do that. Other vendors also have capabilities. I mean, the state of the art is advancing. I mean, we can tell you down to the commit and committer level, like who's making your software.
Yeah.
It's all very complicated until it becomes a business issue. And then it gets really simple.
Yep.
Because if everyone needs to submit these software bills of materials, so I can tell you, we have processed thousands of software bills of materials from vendors, like through the platform, sometimes on their own recognizance, more often at the behest of the customer. And when we get the request, okay, this vendor has to have a software bill of materials, there's this 60-day lag. There's these 60 days that goes by. SBOM's not happening. And we all kind of know what's happening, but I can tell you exactly what's happening. The developers at that supplier are desperately scrambling to update everything that they can in the immediate time frame to make the SBOM look less bad when they submit it to the customer. And so I was joking, with the customer to say, okay, well, they were procuring this SBOM analysis that Ion Channel performs. And I said, we've raised your security posture and you haven't even turned it on.
Yeah.
It's a Heisenberg effect, right? So the observation changes the thing. And so that is what we want. It's become a business issue and now it's going to get solved. And I like to joke around. I want to live in a world where the sales guy is running down the hall to jump on the developers to update their dependencies because he wants his boat.
Right.
And then that's where that collapses all the complexity. And I think that's where we're going in acquisitions, both in public sector enterprises and frankly, in the commercial world as well.
Yeah,
And
we just need to get, go ahead, Katie, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add, when we started the CMMC and in the NIST 171, there's an entire section about system integration. And, Stuart and Ed can probably speak about this ad nauseum. When we were going through the CMMC about software, there was a lot of discussion within the DoD. Myself, and back then it was Jack Wilmer, the CISO. How do you know what, because everything is software enabled. I mean, and every supply chain has software in it. And the idea of cyber/software and how do you, understand the risk associated. Most companies are unaware of the security stacks that they're using and the software that makes them up.
Right.
And, when we were doing, COVID happened and we were still working on the CMMC and Ed and Stuart, I don't remember the conversation, but it was the cafeteria app. Do you remember that? Where we had to basically, I'll give JC Dobson and Mike Gordon, who's now gone to the bad side of McDonald's. It was at that point in time, we had companies going through looking at DIVCAC and they were adding software at the time of relevance, right? So in COVID, this is an example of how critical software is to your supply chain. Everybody needed to get if you were working at one of the large primes, a cafeteria app to order food during the pandemic because we weren't allowed to be in the same circles, right? So how do you bring software onto your network rapidly? And, in the NIST 171, there's a whole SI on how you look and observe software. And one of the first things the AB said, the working group was like, well, all software needs to be audited. No, right. You've got to have the processes and then the policies in place, the culture around software cybersecurity, and for JC's company, the fact that we're able to, the fact that Exiger now we have the capability to do continuous monitoring on software is a game changer. And
Absolutely.
you have to understand that our adversaries know this. They know what software we've all bought. I mean, that's been, the challenge set is we're transparent in America. We are not like our adversaries. And I have talked about this ad nauseum since 2019, that, state-owned enterprises in China, when there is a ransomware attack or a DDoS attack, or there's a software vulnerability, that whole SOE, that supply chain, is notified immediately. Risk is not a four-letter word in China.
Yep.
They share it openly, and they do it rapidly so they can thwart and change the TTPs. We, on the other hand, want to bury it, right? And then now we have this new thing, the SEC wants to know if you've had a breach, or a software company's had a breach of relevancy. We're still, we're still stuck on stupid, right? Because the event has already occurred. The premise of the CMMC is to get people to be the left of boom, to get there before the app. I did an event a few weeks ago, and Chaz Morrison spoke. He's one of the professional staffers, a policy director for the China Select Committee. And he said something that really resonated with me, and I hope you all listen and write this one down. He goes, "We're all looking for the smoking gun. But the problem is the gun's already gone off. I want to find the problem when the ammo is in the barrel of the gun." And that's what JC does, right? She finds that problem before it becomes, it shuts down your company, or the malware has, eroded you, or, we can't protect from people, right? That's been the challenge set. People are the weakest link in our supply chains, right? Because people make mistakes. Machines generally don't make mistakes.
Right. And to the point that JC made about, this becoming a business issue, we want it to be a business issue before there's a consequence and an incident that has occurred. We want this to be a business issue to be able to really address and see that people are proactively preventing those types of incidents. And let me ask, and if we can get to this quickly, because I know that we have still a lot to cover, but in the first 3 episodes, we learned about unauthorized access, about the consequences of intentional, unintentional human behavior, about complexity. Where does supply chain risk fit within the bad actors playbook?
So supply chain attacks.
It's at the top. Sorry.
Sorry.
It is at the top.
It is at the top. Yeah, and these are indirect attacks, but it's not necessarily a new playbook, right? So we've seen this slide in the previous episodes, right? So it's the same basic attack formulation, just directed, directed at a supply chain member, either because it's a path of least resistance or a point of leverage. So I'll give a couple examples, right? So we see supply chain attacks that utilize step 3, where you're trying to get sort of that initial foothold. Maybe rather than tricking one of the victim's employees with a social engineering attempt like a phishing, you might put a backdoor in some software that the victim company uses. Maybe that's an easier exploit, easier to get that done and get in there. Or they might focus on the social engineering on a subcontractor, maybe a small company that's not very sophisticated, but they have access to the victim's cloud systems. Maybe a service provider that has admin access, but sort of weak security procedures could be an easy way in. We also see supply chain attacks where they play the playbook at the supply chain level right up till step 7, and then they're able to kind of jump over and get access to the crown jewels that are held by those suppliers' customers. So one attack, many victims. This is the leverage point, right? Where they may have fully played out their playbook in the supplier, but then that gives them access to a whole bunch of folks. We'll hear some of this in the case studies. So,
and I was going to say, let's maybe move on to a couple of the more tangible things. I think this will become a little more understandable. I mean, JC, you described the software supply chain in supply chain risk a few minutes ago. And if anyone doubts it's real, we only need to look at incidents like SolarWinds or the exploitation of the Log4j vulnerability. The impact of Log4j was massive. It was widespread. And if I'm not mistaken, I think we're still feeling its effects today. Can you tell us a little bit about, this particular incident? Can you describe what happened, how it happened, who it happened to, and what the impact of Log4j was?
So, people who lived through this, you still have the kind of gray hairs a couple years on, but there was a very, very popular component, very well-maintained component, but it was compromised. There was an exploit for it, and it was in everything because it was for logging for Java applications. So it was collecting a lot of important information, and you need a logging capability in enterprise systems. So it was everywhere. Now, what a lot of people still don't know about Log4j, it was an exploit, a security vulnerability that was found by an engineer at Alibaba, Chinese company. And it was published publicly as a vulnerability, as an exploitable vulnerability. After that, the Chinese government essentially, kind of sanctioned Alibaba, slapped Alibaba, and they passed a rule, they imposed a rule that if you are an engineer at a Chinese company who finds an exploitable vulnerability like this that can be used globally, you are not to report it publicly. You are to report it to the Chinese Communist Party, because that's now what we call an equity. And so this is very important. People miss this because there was a panic about this components and everything. And then there was a supply chain problem because no one had transparency on the software that they were buying from vendors. Internally, maybe they could see where Log4j was in their internal development pipelines, but externally, there was no way to do it, right? All the contracts say you can't reverse engineer the product. So this was a lot of the impetus for software composition analysis tooling, but also for, I co-ran the working group at NTIA for software transparency, which turned into the SBOM minimum elements that were in, Executive Order 14028 that are in the FDA. Like, everyone realized, if you don't know what the ingredients are that are in a product that you're buying, when there's a crisis related to the exploitation of a component, you literally have to contact every vendor and ask them if this is in their stuff. And then they have to do the investigation and get back to you. And meantime, you're exposed. You could be exploited. So the need for transparency was what sort of Log4j forced all the security people saying, yeah, we really need to know what's in the stuff because there's exploits and Heartbleed, even going back as far as that bad version of OpenSSF. It wasn't in the first party operations of the companies. It was in the IBM product or the Oracle product or another vendor's product, right? No one knew where it was. So this was a real watershed moment for software transparency. But then what I'll put on top of that, because CVE is a lagging indicator of risk, right? Horse is already out of the barn. Now we're into incident response. Our focus is leading indicators of risk, right? What about a piece of software might tell you that, okay, maybe there hasn't been a published exploit about it, but it has all the signs and patterns of life of something that's going to have an exploit about it. But more importantly, these indicators like technical debt, like if you have an SBOM, we'll quantify, okay, how many major versions behind is everything? How much end of life is in there? How many of his components are just being maintained by one guy who may or may not feel like getting out of bed, right? If you something changed, because the technical debt and the active maintenance is what's going to keep you from, or the vendor, from doing the Log4j update, because every major version behind, that's what we call a breaking change. It means it's incompatible with certain things that come afterwards or before. Roll for damage, right? Because if I get a SBOM and everything in there is 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 major versions behind, and we've seen that in federal systems, when something goes wrong, it will be impossible for that supplier to remediate, update, and ship you a safe version without refactoring their entire product. And there was one agency, one open source vulnerability, critical, kind of like Log4j, not Log4j, but it took them 3,000 man hours to refactor that system. So the update wouldn't break it. So when we pull an SBOM through, this is what we're telling you before you buy it. This vendor, if anything goes wrong, does not have a snowball's chance of being able to fix it. And that's what supply chain risk management is about, not just vulnerability management.
And when we look at
systems in this day, to this day, because of the level of technical debt.
And we look at Log4j again, which was a risk then that existed in the software supply chain. What were the consequences? We talked about it being, kind of a vast impact. How many companies roughly did it affect? What was the overall financial impact?
It was thousands. I mean, it was thousands, tens of thousands of organizations, and how exploitable it was depended on your system security plan. Right? Because you can have, and this is where the sort of compliance absolutists really have to switch to decaf a bit, because I mean, you can have a critically vulnerable component in a application.
Right.
But there are compensating controls as well that are not software updates that are, I mean, if it's sitting behind 6 load balancers, right? You have some compensating controls, and also your language ecosystems. Right. So we were asked immediately, like, do you have any Log4j in your stuff? We don't code in Java. We could confidently say, no, it is nowhere, it is nowhere in ion channel. Because you start to, again, look at, what computing language is this vendor using? And yeah, you could exfiltrate data. It was, it was a very, very serious vulnerability. And so people were scrambling on incident response. Even the federal government was, banks were, everyone was. It was up and down, souped in across sectors and large and small.
And I think what's alarming is the comment you made that Chinese government has said, to companies in China, if you find a vulnerability, don't report it to us. Presumably with bad intentions on their part. It's almost like software companies we know of that have bug bounties so that they can fix defects. This is almost kind of a the opposite of a bug bounty type of program that we see. And it's not
other people's bugs.
Yeah. It's just not, again, it's not just the software supply chain. I think kind of an example, when we look at suppliers, again, Log4j is pretty alarming about how the vulnerabilities in software supply chain can have such broad disruption of business operations. And again, it's especially when organizations fail to follow basic cyber hygiene like patching, and especially when there are known vulnerabilities that are exploited. I mean, lack of good, just basic cyber hygiene, patch management, and so forth is just probably one of the leading causes of exploits for small businesses. And attacks on an individual supplier can disrupt the operations not only of that supplier, but it's going to disrupt those that are their customers. And this is true again of small companies as well as large companies. An example we talk about is Visor Precision. It's a Denver-based manufacturer of precision parts for aerospace and defense. And at the time this incident happened, they had fewer than 50 employees. And in late 2020, they were hit by the Doppelpaymer ransomware. This ransomware, if you're not familiar with it, encrypts and it exfiltrates data. It makes the data inaccessible to the target. And again, those who are responsible, the bad actors typically threaten to publish the stolen information unless the ransom is paid. The information in this case that was compromised included design drawings and documentation of a Lockheed Martin missile antenna system and non-disclosure and other agreements that Visor had in place with companies like Tesla, SpaceX, and Lockheed Martin. It also impacted Northrop Grumman's production schedule. Northrop relied on Visor Precision for critical components in some of its production. And again, this is just one example of supply chain risk. And while the details about the ransom, the financial impact on the company and its customers were not disclosed, it's pretty clear that this attack affected several companies. And so let me toss this to Katie and JC again. We've talked a lot about the issues, but we can't simply sit here and say that the sky is falling without helping people recognize risk within their supply chain and to help them understand how to manage their supply chain risk. And I go back to something Ed said earlier, 77% of companies lack the data and knowledge to fully understand supply chain risk. So where does a company in the DIB start? How do you gain an understanding of these risks? Are there best practices and tools to help you? Just kind of in short, what do you do, especially if you're a small supplier?
So there are multiple things, right? So first and foremost, I always highly recommend for a company, right, reach out, We've done several pilots with different primes where we provide the sub their risk factors, right? So we tell them, these are the areas you have a problem in. I just want to go back to one quick thing that you mentioned, Stuart, about this, the VISR. Or you guys understand that when these attacks happen, it's not out of nowhere, right? So as much as our company, Exiger, I can illuminate a supply chain. I can tell you how critical a supplier is to not just one weapon system or one entity, but thousands, right? Because the supply chain is interconnectivity. The adversary knows who to go after. This is what I've been trying to tell everybody for so long. The adversary is, they've precisely picked the certain vendors that they know that they, with a software attack, do have a lot of bang for their buck, right? It's low cost in their eyes. It definitely affects multiple companies or weapon systems. So you have to be cognizant of it. And one of the things is, as we've been talking, Stuart and Ed and JC, when companies first started in the DoD, we're at a time right now where we're going through, I say, a change, an industry change. Elon Musk said it a few months ago, that by 5 years from now, manufacturing lines will be automated. Does everybody understand the vulnerability that inserts into our day-to-day life? And that if we're, garbage in, garbage out, and if you're not paying attention to the software that's running your systems, that's running your machining tools, that is critical. An adversary can come in and modify an AutoCAD drawing overnight. And if you have an open patch that you haven't completed, that following morning you start tooling and creating and building, and it's a 1/10 of a millimeter off. I've talked about this, right? That's a software design, that's a software attack that has created a kinetic result that will you'll go down through quality assurance, and then next thing you know, you're out of business because the prime can't take that risk. So companies really need to understand that everything is software enabled. Software is a critical part of your supply chain. No matter how big or small you are, the resources to get to these problems is out there, but you need to own it. You need to understand that you are responsible for the culture at your company, not anybody else. And even though there's a software vulnerability that came from a product you may have purchased, it is still onerous on you, the entity that is ingesting that software. You're using it. If you don't have the right culture, you're going to be out of luck. So there's small businesses are not exempt. And this has been the challenge point. A lot of people, smalls, it's so hard. John Gartzka in the DoD is doing a study on the cyber poverty line. What is it that means a small business doesn't have the capability? The problem is, you guys, industry that are listening, you still aren't building security into your rate. And, the NDAA has come out, and I advise everybody on this to go review it, right? The Congress is even telling the DoD, don't go LPTA. It's a bad idea. Low price, technically acceptable, has never been a good thing. And we need to move away from it. Because we've been so lackadaisical about things. Build the cost of security into your rates. The government understands it's going to cost more. Industry has been so concerned about, I don't want to raise my rates. Well, guys, and saying that the NIST 171 is so hard and supply chain is so hard. This is the new world order. You either get on board or get out.
And let me kind of transition to NIST, and I think we're going to come back to some of the specifics, because as we tried to to highlight within the series that NIST 800-171 generally provides guidance, kind of a playbook to address a lot of the issues that we've talked about, certainly with respect to access control, with respect to complexity, provides a little bit less help with respect to supply chain risk management. And I think, as I said earlier, it kind of provides us a good start for understanding and managing supply chain risk. And specifically, the risk assessment domain 3.11 requires organizations to periodically assess risk to their operations, assets, and individuals resulting from process, storage, or transmission of CUI. And this includes supply chain risk. I mean, we can also look at 800-161, which is entitled Cybersecurity Supply Chain Risk Management Practices for Systems and Organizations. And this provides specific practices and controls for organizations to manage the security or cybersecurity aspects of supply chain risk. But yeah, Ed, can you briefly explain what's included in 311? What are some of the requirements that exist in NIST 800-171 with respect to risk assessment?
Yeah, we always try to, in this series, we're trying to always bring it back to, why are we doing these things that CMMC talks about? And I want to pick on just one item, which is the risk assessment requirement. You mentioned it's in section 3.11.1, and it's sort of this generic sounding requirement. It says periodically assess risk. And it doesn't say a lot more. There is some explanation in there that says, risk assessments also consider risk from external parties, e.g. service providers, contractor operating systems on behalf of the organization, individuals accessing organizational systems, and outsourcing entities. So that sentence and the examples that are in there sort of points you to the supply chain, but it doesn't talk a lot about, doesn't give explicit guidance of all the things we've been talking about today. But I want to encourage people to kind of think about that differently. Don't think about 3.11.1 as this sort of check the box, do my annual risk assessment, no big deal. Yeah, I got a 5-page report. Think about it as a mandate to really dig in and get the kind of visibility and manage the risk in your supply chain that we've been talking about today. So it's not explicit. You could go to the minimum compliant and just barely touch on it in your annual risk assessment, or you could take it seriously. You could pull out the NIST 800-161, right? The guidance that you mentioned, Stuart, on supply chain risk management. And that isn't mandated by CMC. It doesn't tell you have to follow that standard, but doing that is the best way to achieve sort of a complete and accurate picture of what the risk is to your organization. So ultimately, when you think about risk management, think about where could that risk come from? And if you think about it correctly and critically, you'll see that a lot of that risk is external, and put appropriate resources into managing that. I also want to mention real briefly the DFARS clause around supply chain risk management. It's DFARS 252.239-7018. So that clause has very little language in it. It says contractors must mitigate supply chain risk. That's about it. There's some definitions. There's some government actions to manage supply chain risk. But what the contractor is told to do is just a nice, simple thing: mitigate it. Well, before we can mitigate it, we got to understand it. We got to manage it. We got to, make decisions about what's acceptable, what's not.
Right. And to your point a bit, earlier, the worst thing that a company can do is say, 3.11, I need to do a risk assessment. Let me go through, I've kind of created the red, yellow, green matrix. I can look at it. Now I put it in the drawer because I can say I've satisfied 3.11. I can move forward and pass my assessment. Katie, how should companies really be approaching risk assessment, and what do they need to do beyond just kind of assessing risk? What do you need to do to ensure that you're then acting upon that to be able to not only understand, but to mitigate the risks that you've identified?
So there's a couple of things. Ed, first I want to say everybody should be paying attention to FAR 40. If you have not looked at, what is coming out, the FAR is created a whole new section based on supply chain. And in that, I want to make sure everybody is aware of this. People that say, I don't work for DOD, I don't have to worry about CMMC. In that FAR 40, they are including the 32 CFR and the 48 CFR, which is what, guys? Ding, 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 the CMMC. So it's going to be a federal thing. I keep trying to explain to people that this is not just a DOD thing. This is going bigger. and people need to be paying attention. Now, when you identify risk, and the remediation or retirement of risk is critical. It's one thing to say, I found a problem. What most people do is they say, I found a problem, and then they put a question mark and they don't know what to do with it. I've been working tirelessly to try and get the right packages together on resourcing. So when you do find a risk, right, you should be a good steward of the information. Don't, and that's why I say China's state-owned enterprises, the CCP, does it right. When there's a subcontractor in that supply chain and they have a problem, they report up. They don't hide it. That is by law, you report up. And we need to have that same type of conversations, that when a small business finds a problem, right, you're a better sub saying, I've got this issue and this is how I'm going to remediate it. Does this meet the acceptance of the prime that you're working for? That's a big thing, right? Finding risk and saying, I've solved that problem. Like JC mentioned, right? People will create an SBOM, take them 60 days, and they're going to clean out all the stuff they don't want you to see. When you have a risk you have found or a vulnerability, the remediation, you need to be open and have those discussions. We work with the DoD CIO and the Federal Acquisition Security Council on something called the Product Assurance Playbook, where when we find vulnerabilities and we companies like Chertoff Group or others that are out there that come up with the remediation strategies, we know they're going to cost money, folks, right? That's thing one. It's generally going to cost you something. So that's why people don't want to fix the problem. We have to get beyond that. But the remediations, we have not, and this is, I think, the new day, there isn't a standard on what is a good risk remediation strategy, right? It's kind of like everyone's putting their thumb in the air and saying, is this good enough? And when we were doing 889, and I was looking at when companies would say, okay, we have Huawei in our systems, and this is our remediation. We can't retire the risk, but this is how we're remediating it. The CIO didn't even have what is good in that regard. And I think that's where, NIST needs to kind of come in and say, what does good risk reduction look like? And and what I would say to people is, don't be afraid to have conversations with your supply chain about those risks, because they have them too. The moment you have that risk, they have it too. Right. So it's remediation. It's got to be, you've got to have it internally in the C-suite. They've got to understand that level of complexity of what it can do to their brand, their business, their day-to-day functions. Who is going to be the person that figures out the risk remedy, right? But my favorite one is getting to risk retirement, right? So with Huawei, how did we retire a good deal of that risk? Was we ripped out a lot of security cameras, and that was a risk retirement. It didn't exist anymore. That doesn't work when you have a Bosch machine on your floor that has a vulnerability in the software. You can't throw the machine away. So you have to have remediation strategies, and don't think outside the box. This is one of the things, it doesn't mean that if a software is bad, right, that there's something wrong with it, that you need to rip it out. Maybe it's you need to air gap the system, or maybe, as JC was discussing, what are the protocols before it? Is it behind the firewall? I mean, there's a bunch of different things that can be done. Doesn't mean you have to rip it out, right? But you have to have the culture. And then go back to how do I assume risk? How do I communicate risk? How do I retire risk? And how do I budget for that?
Right. And
JC?
remediating it is, I'm sorry, go ahead, JC.
I think that Katie's point about lowest cost technically acceptable, I don't think we're really there yet. In terms of that premium, we're telling people that they can do that, but we're not necessarily convincing them that it's going to work for them. So everybody who's bidding on business, they want to get the business, and they are still afraid that, if I come in over my competitor who's spending less on this and that, I'm not going to get it. And so I think we need to take that next step as customers to put various things on our analysis of alternatives, like, okay, there's a row for this, there's a row for this, right. Your technical debt, your, time to response, your everything. And if people who are bidding know that those are things on the analysis of alternatives, it'll give them a bit more conviction that the customer means what they say they mean, not just, well, we want more for the same price, which is of course what every customer wants.
Right, and I think this is why ultimately CMMC came out with really the position that, that cybersecurity wasn't going to be a fourth pillar. It was going to be a foundation, a requirement that that the rest needed to be built upon. And Katie, when you talked about the need to remediate risk, to mitigate it, I mean, just any quick thoughts on people who look at transfer of risk through insurance, cyber insurance, or other? Doesn't that still leave the rest of the supply chain vulnerable?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and then that's probably the biggest challenge set, right? That's why I say that, in your conversations, we talked about your security programs, right? How are
Yep.
you communicating that you have found a vulnerability, that you've remediated the risk, or you're in the process of, to your prime, to your company, et cetera? It is the most compelling part. And that's what I keep trying to explain. The remediation, when you do it, be loud and proud about it, share it, because that same remediation that you've done may protect you. But if your partner that you're working with, same vulnerability, and they haven't remediated it, you still got it.
Right.
And that's what
Exactly.
people are that thinking that I did. That's why supply chain risk matters, right? Just because you did the remediation. But if your partner, your supply chain didn't do that remediation, it does nothing. And
Exactly.
that's what supply chain risk is. And that's why CMMC, the culture of it was, because I need to know, right, in the cyber insurance companies, right, I need to know that you have a culture of cyber responsibility, of the requirements, what is needed to maintain your network continuity. That's what that's all about. And that's why, the insurance companies, when the DoD put a pause on relooking at CMMC, the insurance companies were calling me every single day.
Yep.
Like, what are you doing about this? And they, in the interim, I've told people, give your SPUR score, right? Let your prime know your SPUR score, because that's really indicative of where you are until you get CMMC. But having the, even that challenge is, trust but verify, and the SPUR is not a verifiable until DIBCAP or joint surveillance comes out there. But it is everything. I mean, people, the risk that is coming in the new, as we move forward, as AI, more machining, more, robots are out there, more, if you guys aren't ensuring that your supply chain is remediating any problem, you still have it.
Absolutely. And again, Katie, I thank you, JC, Ed, for joining us today. We could probably continue this conversation for at least another hour, and I think be able to hit on some additional key nuggets, some key topics that really are important. I think the key takeaway is that you really do need to appreciate the extent to risk in your supply chain affects your business and your ability to supply. And as we said, that you're in other people's supply chain, you have people within your supply chain, and the impact of risk in those supply chains really does threaten your ability to perform. It threatens your customers' ability to perform. I know we're running a little late on time on this. We will try to respond to the questions that we've received in email. I do encourage you to watch our past episodes of CMMC. Why is it we do it, as well as to look at our future episodes. The next one that we have coming up is called Thinking Critically About Security, and there will be looking specifically at the security assessment domain and why taking a mindset that you've already been hacked is important as you investigate your own security within your organization. So again, want to thank everybody for joining us today. Katie, JC, Ed, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Stuart, can I have 5 seconds of extra time?
Absolutely.
Two things. So this whole thing of the CMMC, when we started it, and I thank you guys for continuing your passion about it, and getting involved. The community around this, I think, we're down to 120 people on this call. I want to make one thing real clear, because everybody's talking about the cost of, right? The cost of the CMMC is minimal comparatively to what the cost of implementing the NIST 171 is. And that's where, and I say, build it into your rates, folks. The cost of the CMMC audit is minuscule compared to what you should have been doing for the past 10 years. And the government is aware of it, and cost realism is coming. I cannot tell you all enough that if you continue to not build it into your rates, it is going to be noticed by the Corps or the COTAR, and they are going to deselect you based on the fact that you are not pricing it right. So start, that is, I think the most critical point of this is that all the things that we're talking about, the NISTs 171, the FARs, all of it, the compliance measures that we've had to put in place, the CMMC is in place because industry didn't do what they were required by law to do. If you don't get it done, like there's not going to be a quarter. There's not going to be a thing where the government issues waivers. If you all are paying attention, they're hammering down on that. So please, if you have questions or concerns, reach out to your primes, talk to them about it, because like I said, the cost of the certification is minimal comparatively to the cost of actually having the right culture in your company.
Absolutely. And as we've been trying to emphasize through this series, you need to understand why we're doing this. It's not about, again, a compliance exercise. It's really appreciating how things like risk in your supply chain affects your business, but also affects your ability to support the security of our nation. And I mean, ultimately, that's what we're about within the defense industrial base. So
Katie
again,
said on day zero, it's not a checklist, right, Katie?
It is not. It is absolutely not a checklist. And the only thing I can say to people is understand that the threat that you have today is going to be different tomorrow. The adversary is learning. They're using AI to learn as fast as they're throwing these things out. So if you guys are not, and if you think it's going to get better, it's not. But so start today, right? And like we go back, and I think every time I talk about this, get up, make your bed every morning. That way, when big things happen during the day, it's not going to stress you out. We have to have a culture of cyber, of the right processes and policies and things in place so that you can get ahead and to the left of boom. And you can look and say, oh, snap, I have a bullet in the chamber, right? Figure out how not to have it go off. I don't want to have any more smoking guns. I'd much rather get ahead of it. And I think everybody else does as well.
No, I think that's a great analogy and a great way for us to, to be able to think about it. So any last words?
Never ask Katie Arrington for a last please. Have we not learned that?
Very good. Well, again, thank you all for joining us, and thank you to those who have tuned in and listened with our conversation today.
Take care.
Great.
One team, one fight.
Great.